Well, good afternoon or late morning or whatever it is. According to how much you ate and how tired you are, that determines that. Let me start right away. I think I have a lot of information. I'm going to give you the first part of the information very quickly because the meat is at the end, because that is part of my responsibility is to talk about how we make this thing work in Kansas City. And so I want to get there pretty quickly. But let me start off talking about my wife, who is a fabulous cook. And I didn't know how bad of a cook I was until I understood how good of a cook she is. But when we first started, coming from a bachelor world, we first got together and she would be cooking and making the meal, and I would kind of sneak in there, and I had my personal biases, things that I really liked. So what I would do is I would stick something in the recipe or in the food while she wasn't looking. And what would happen is what I added would take a good idea and create a disaster. And so what she would do is she would look at the recipe and say, how did it get this bad? It's because she really wanted to fix it. She wanted to figure out what adjustments do I need to make to keep this thing from continuing to happen. But I was so ashamed of what I put in the recipe that I didn't want to tell her. So she kept trying to tweak things and make adjustments, and she's trying to change. But what's really happening is the historical insights that she have are skewed because I left out some critical information. And thus you have our history books. We have been given a lot of information and a recipe to build a great country. However, we had some ingredients that we put in there that were based on personal biases, and because those ingredients are things that we're so ashamed of, we leave it out of our history books, and we hate to talk about it, and we don't want it to be exposed. And because it's not exposed, every tweak that we try to do ends up becoming a greater disaster. And it got quiet in the room. And so what I really want us to do is I want us to find a recipe for success when it comes to building a nation, a country, a city, a collaboration of churches that really reflect what the Creator intended when He designed our present and our future. So here's what's going to be in this recipe. A number of things is going to be in here. We're going to go through this pretty quickly. We're going to have a review of its philosophical foundation. We want to try to figure out what we really want to do with this recipe. Do we want to gain weight? Do we want to lose weight? Do we want to become healthy? Is it just for greed? I mean, what are we going to put together? We want to think of our philosophy. Secondly, we want to think of examine the influential variables. What are the things that makes a difference one way or the other? Do I put more green stuff in it? Do I put more meat in it? Because those are the variables that kind of help us understand what we're dealing with. We want to understand the historical implications or applications. What have these things been used for in the past, and what have they done? We also want to adopt best practices. We want to view and adopt things that tend to work. And then lastly, we want to have an approach of implementation that is built on feedback loops. We want to know, when do we taste this and see what it tastes like, and when do we make adjustments so that we know what we're doing? And so the Plan, Do, Check, Act acronym is what we want to begin to apply to our discussion. So that's what we really want to do, is we want to lay out a recipe that we think will lead to success. So let's title our discussion this: a recipe for the church to impact Kansas City for the common good. And the first thing that we must do to pull off this task is we must recognize that our success depends on our ability to become philosophically interdependent. Not independent, but interdependent. That means one person is not better than the other, but the necessity of all of us together is so critical that we cease to exist to be complete without each other. It's kind of like a body. When I was younger, I didn't think most of my body parts really mattered. So I never paid attention to certain things. And then when I got older and girls started looking better, then I thought the only things that mattered are the things you could see in the mirror. And so I didn't pay attention to other things. And then when I got older, all of those things that I didn't pay attention to started showing up and protesting. Like I got out of bed once and my niece said, "You haven't been treating me right." And so all of a sudden, walking became a real issue. That I drunk a whole lot of pop. And so all of a sudden my sugar started doing some crazy stuff. I mean, all of this stuff that I've ignored all of this time started now creeping up and becoming a real issue, and I now had to deal with it. But I couldn't neglect all the stuff that had happened in the past, because that's what contributed us to getting to the point where we're at right now. So I had to really figure out how to pull this thing together with consideration of all elements so that I could be better. If I drank too much sugar yesterday, it has a lot to do with how I manage my health today. I can't say, well, that was yesterday, that's over with, we don't have to deal with that anymore. All right? So, interdependence. Here's what the Bible says about interdependence. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 15 and 16. The discussion is, in general, about, he's telling them how the church ought to be managed and how it ought to see itself. Now, he's not talking about an individual local church, he's talking about the church in general. And here's what he says. He says, instead, he says, speaking the truth in love. That means that we got to be honest with each other, and we got to do it as if we care for each other. And I know it's very, very difficult. I'm just now really understanding what honesty means to white people, because honesty doesn't always mean I'm going to tell you directly what I think. Sometimes white folks will say, that was very, very good, shake my hand and say, I'll see you later, and they never call me. So that means I really didn't like what you did, and so therefore, and black folks, sometimes black folks come off telling you whatever they tell you, we come off so aggressive and so assertive that you think we don't even like you no more. And really, we're just saying, I just didn't like what you just did. So I'm expecting for you to call tomorrow. You say, well, the way you talk to me, I expected I would never hear from you again. And we're like, I don't know where you got that from. But the reality is that we need to figure out what it looks like to speak the truth in love, and at least understand what it looks like when we come from each other. Then he says, speaking the truth in love, he says, we will in all things grow unto him. So our source of growth, or the place which we grow, needs not to be measured based on what any talents or any benefits that any of us bring to the table, but we're not trying to grow up in each other. I'm not trying to be more like you, or you trying to be more like me. Worst thing I've ever seen is a white dude trying to be like a black dude, or a black dude trying to be like a white dude. If you don't say what's up, I still know what you're talking about. And if I don't say hello, I hope that makes sense to you. We have to recognize that what we bring to the table has its own unique value, and we don't have to be each other, but we both have to grow up in Christ. He is the head. Christ is the one who is in charge of all things. That means, in parentheses, I put in there that the biblical alternative for living in every area of life is what God is expecting from us. And then we grow, and then from him, the whole body is joined together. So our connection with him tells us what pulls us together, not how much I like you or what I think about you. In other words, I'm not together with you because of you, I'm together with you because of him. And then it says, it is the whole body is fitly joined, held together. Now this is what it's held together by. Now we join together because of Christ. So we're all brothers and sisters whether we like it or not. Then it says, but we're joined together, or we experience that togetherness by every supporting ligament, everything and every individual contribution to the whole, and it grows and it builds itself up in love as each part does its work. Or it doesn't build itself up because each part's not doing its work. You know what I mean? If we're not contributing to the total body, then my foot can be the greatest foot in the world, but it has no value in its individualization. And so my foot can think it's cute. It can paint itself, it can put on great shoes, it can do all those different kinds of things, but if it doesn't contribute to the body, then it does not fulfill its intent. So we can be a great urban church, but if we don't have any connection with a suburban church or a rural church or other churches, then we have failed to be a body. And in Kansas City, we might need to pay attention to ourselves. The second thing is we must see our division as evidence of our carnality or our worldliness. In other words, when we're wrong, we have to think here's a part of our problem is we don't think we're doing anything wrong. If our church is growing and we're doing good, we don't think we're doing anything wrong, even if we're doing opposite of what the Creator expected. There was a video that came out with some kids, and the kids were cussing. And it was interesting how proudly they cursed. And the parents were in the background going, oh, like they didn't get it from them. But the kids had no idea they were wrong. So they proudly said their cuss words and stood up with pride and said cuss words and used them correctly in sentences. Because nobody ever told them that that was wrong. Well, here's the deal. Our divisiveness is worldly and carnal and sinful. And if we don't recognize that, we will think our cuss words help us shine. Notice what he says here. He says in 1 Corinthians chapter number 3, verses 2 and 3, and I'm just going to hit this real quick. He said, I gave you milk. In other words, I really wanted to feed you, but I gave you milk and not solid food because you weren't ready for it. He says, indeed, you still aren't ready for it. He says, here's how I know you're immature and worldly and carnal. He says, are you still worldly? He says, are you still worldly? He says, for since there is jealousy and quarreling among you, then you are, he says, are you not worldly? He says, are you not acting like mere men? So he says, now, he's not saying y'all fighting each other. He's not saying you got in the middle of the street and fight each other. We have found fancy ways to fight. We fight on Facebook. We fight by the silent treatment, like I'm not calling you no more. We fight by stop meeting and stop showing up to the program. We fight by camouflaging our distance with fluffy goodness, like we meet once a year and have a service together. That's not unity. Let me get back with that. Now here, so we got to figure out a way to be able to make solid connections. And when we're quarreling, then we have to see that as a transition to becoming more healthy rather than a reason to distance ourselves, recognizing that, see, if you have a battle with a sin, like let's suppose you smoke weed or something. And so while you are struggling to try to get over that, then you recognize that's a quarrel, that's a battle that you're going through, but you know it's a sin, so you don't give up on it. When we have relationships, if we knew that our divisiveness was a sin, then I think we would treat it totally different. That means that we would fight, we would get through the issues, but we would keep coming to the meetings because we know we got to figure out a way to get over it. Worldliness is this. It is the perceptions, behaviors, and relationships patterned after a pagan or a unbiblical system. Here's what Mark says. Mark says, here's the biggest command. When Christ came down and offered himself as the king of the Jews, then the biggest problem he ran into was the Pharisees and Sadducees. The Pharisees and Sadducees set up a system, and the scribes, they set up a system that was really different from what was happening at the tabernacle, where you had the Levites and you had all the tribes and everything else. Their system was set up more like Rome, where they had a hierarchy system. Now, when God came in, he says, I want to break down the hierarchy system. I want to break down the system of class, and I want everybody to come together in a kingdom system. And what they said was, you don't know what you're talking about. You must not be Jesus, and so therefore we're looking for somebody else. In fact, they came together and had a joint congressional meeting to discuss how they were going to get rid of him, in spite of the fact that the Republicans and the Pharisees and the Sadducees couldn't get along any other way. Okay, so here's what it says in Mark. He says, you have let go of the commandments of God and are holding on to human traditions. I'm wondering, would he say that about America? It's interesting when I go to someone and I tell them my experience in America, and they don't look like me because their experience is different because they don't look like me. Then they don't believe, they think I'm a liar because their experience is different. Like, when I talk to somebody, I say, whatever, police. I work with a lot of police. I love police officers, everything else. I work with a lot of them in counseling and all that kind of stuff. But my experience with police hadn't been all that joyful. When I got stopped, I was, they were talking about how many times have you been stopped? I've been stopped a bunch of times, and I was thinking about all the places in the Kansas City area where I got stopped and actually had to get out of my car and sit on the curb, handcuffs, while they searched my car. And I got to about 48 and stopped. So when I talk to my friends and they haven't had that experience, they'd be like, no, that can't be happening. And the worst thing that'll happen is if you get a white person with you in the car and you get stopped by the police and they stop you for nothing and they come and they treat you like they always do, make you get out, lay on the ground or whatever they do, and then your white friend starts saying, "Why are you doing this?" And you're saying, "Shh." You just don't realize how bad this could get. You know, trust me, it could get really, really, really bad. Laying on the concrete in the rain for 15 minutes is nothing compared to what I would go through if you keep talking. So just be very, very quiet. I mean, I think the reality is so different that people just think it's not real. And so therefore, when we sit down and talk about how to collaborate at the church level, then you're like, well, I mean, you just can't get to where my real pain is. All right? So the third thing is, and this is the thing that's going to be hard for you to swallow today, so let me just give you a heads up right up front. It is we must be willing to take a realistic assessment of the current reality beyond our personal experiences. The things that you experience can't be how you paint reality. Okay? So let me give you a little bit of American history. I'll start in the 1700s and just kind of wash through it really, really quick. So first of all, America was founded on this idea that we needed to govern freedom in the most effective way. And we wanted to govern freedom in an effective way, and we wanted to use a biblical frame of reference to do it. However, if you're going to begin to develop anything of structure, then you had to come up with some idea. Just like when our canonization was put together, when the Bible was put together, you had trusted people who get together, look at the primary documents, and figure out a strategy for which we can put them into implementation. Well, the same thing happened here. You had a group of guys who got together. They were our founding fathers to try to figure out how do we pull this off. Well, one of the ways in which they pulled this off is they looked at the science to determine the value of people, because they did not want to do classism, and so they wanted to look at the value of people. A guy named Carl von Lunis, we still use a lot of his stuff. Matter of fact, we still use most of his stuff. He came up with a way to express the value of humans. And so let me give you this real quickly. Have anything ever been up there? Oh, there we go. All right. These are the four categories that he laid out. And I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll read a couple of them. The second one is the Homo Europaeus, which is the white person, blue-eyed, gentle. Now, not only did he lay out the categories, but he also laid out how you govern them. And he says these folks are governed by laws. So basically he says white Europeans who came in, they were governed by laws. I want you to look at the last one, and those were the Africans, or those who came from, those who were called black. He says the black are considered cunning and lazy and lustful and careless and governed by caprice or swift change. That means you got to treat them kind of like an animal. And if you treat them like an animal, then they will learn instinctively to do what you say do. But don't let them get away with anything, because they're just going to drift in a bad way. I mean, this was a scientific study that he laid out there, and he demonstrated this. Now, after that, of course, that basic information is what our founding fathers took to try to figure out how you come up with a strategy that agrees with the science that will help us figure out how to govern each other. So let me give you some discussion. Benjamin Franklin, who is a scientist, he says this. He says, "Why increase the sons of Africa by planting them in America," he says, where we have so fair an opportunity by excluding all blacks and tannies, those are black people who are light skinned, and then he says, and increasing the lovely whites and reds. Then you had Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, one of our presidents, who said this. He says, "I advance it, therefore, as a suspicion only that the blacks, whether originally a distinct race or made distinct by time and circumstance, are inferior to whites in the endowment of both body and mind," their physical bodies and the way they think. Abraham Lincoln, our penny man, the guy who's on our penny, he says this. He says, "There is a physical difference between the white and the black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together." He says, "While they do remain together, there must be a position of superiority and inferiority, and as much as any man in favor," he says, "I am as much of any man in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Of course, who wouldn't think that way? He says, any man. Here's Henry Berry, who is assessing the elements of the first implementation of the Constitution, and the amendments are being formed. He was one of the leaders of the House of Representatives. He's given kind of his assessment of what they have put together in order to govern our country, and here's what it says. He says, "We have, as far as possible, closed every avenue by which the light may enter into the slave's mind." He says, "If we could extinguish the capacity to see the light, our work will be complete. They will then be on the level of the beast of the field, and we then should be safe." So their whole idea is to come up with a system to govern, but it was based on the science that they had. Now, don't get mad at those guys. That's all they had at that particular point, and they thought it was right. The other piece that they put in there that we don't talk about a lot is the manifest destiny. Manifest destiny, if you look it up, was the right, the biblical right to do all of the things they were doing, whatever it takes to expand the direction they were expanding, because they felt like God had called them to this new land. Those are our founding fathers. So we went from a system of classism to a system of racism. So let's talk about the difference between the two. A system of classism is this. It is a system of advantage and privilege and opportunities based on class that has adverse impact on another or others class of people. Racism is this. It is a system of advantage, privilege, opportunity that is based on race that has an adverse impact on others, another group of people. So from classism that made some people lower, we went to racism that made some people lower, and we put a system in place that would begin to ensure that the light of day would never be seen by certain groups of people. And that was the way we were going to build our economy and become an America. Now, some people say it was a long time ago and racism was gone and all those different kind of things, and all of this stuff we put in place, really, if you think about it, Jim Crow was put in place in the 1800s, and in 1965, then we decided that Jim Crow was a bad idea, and all those laws that were based on that foundation, we assume changed because we thought Jim Crow was a bad idea. And so, in reality, that would be like if you got an abused kid who was in an abusive relationship, abusive family all of his life, and then he's 18 years old, and he leaves the abusive family and all the trauma and all the abuse and all that kind of stuff. And I say to him, look, all of that's in the past. Just forget all about that and just live your life just like everybody else. And we would say that's crazy. Well, in the same notion, we got to think that what we put together has some sustaining effect. If we don't think it has a sustaining effect, then we can't think the Bible has a sustaining effect, because the same process that was put together based on the belief in those guys is the same thing. They did use the same process to put together our canonization. So we have to recognize that that process has long-term effect. Now, there's a couple of things I want to show you, and you're going to feel very uncomfortable with this, because this is the reality that we got to be able to face, to be able to say. I tell you, Germany has committed themselves to never doing another Holocaust. And the way they do that is to make sure that if you go through their education process or anything else, you will learn everything about what took place so that it will never happen again in Germany. In America, what we said was, listen, we just don't want to talk about it. So let's take it out of our history books. And so here you have a race of people who had a huge influence over history, and then what we decided to do was, let's just put a couple paragraphs in there, and then once a month we'll highlight the people who did make it so that we won't have to deal with it. And in the church, if we're going to tell the truth in love, if our combined experiences is what brings us to become a whole person, then we got to be able to sit down and talk about this stuff. So some of the stuff that we talk about, from 1960 to 1970, this is kind of an image of things that were taking place in our country. I can move on from 1970 to 1980. This is an image from those days. Now, I want to talk for a minute from a personal perspective. My dad, when he was born in the South, and when he was born, the guy who was had finished his degree, and they had county doctors at that time. The guy who was moving to be the doctor, he was a guy who had, he was one of the Klansmen was the chairman of the board of the medical board that really helped them get assigned to a doctor. But you had to initiate your commitment to purity. And purity was, since you had to treat the other races, then you had to demonstrate your commitment to them. So here's what he had to do. He had to take acid and pour it in the eyes of some black children. And one of the black children that was born, he gave birth to my uncle and my father, who were twins. The guy was not as good at it as some of the other guys, and he overpoured the acid in my uncle's eyes, and it burned right through his brains. He died. For my father, he overpoured it, and it caused his right eye to be permanently damaged. This is a picture of my dad. And if you can see very clearly, as I was born, as he got older, the same doctor that worked with him gave him a fake eye and continued to work with him. Now, he didn't have a chance. As he got older, you can see that eye is still not real. And even today, when I look at him, this is us today, then he wears dark glasses, but it's still there. Now, my grandmother told me about the whole story, about everything that took place and everything else, and here's what she said. She says, what I don't want you to do is allow this momentary issue to perpetuate your attitude toward other people in your life. We have forgiven him, and we have educated him, and he has grown up and became a great doctor in our family. My father met this guy, and they have talked on several occasions. But every time I look at my father, the person who tells me to get over it, what do I say? Do I look at him and I recognize that his life was handicapped all of his life because this guy had to do this to get a job? And I say, well, that was in the past. But the past is in the present for some of us, according to where you can live and where you can work. All right, let me hit you with the last one, and this one I'll spend my next few minutes on. And that is this: we must be willing to execute change that is strategic, that is significant, that is measurable, and that is multi-generational. First thing we got to recognize that we no longer should have this lasting commitment to the system that we're in at all costs. We hold to our system, which should influence this system. I mean, the Jews got in trouble every time they got so entangled in the other system that their system started to disappear. And that is exactly what has happened to the church in America. The church has disappeared, and we look more like America than we do the church. And so therefore, America can drift because it has no moral fiber by which to hold on to. The moral fiber has now become the culture of the country. So what we have to do is recapture the moral fiber and then persuade the country that to move in a direction that its original intent was, which is to manage freedom in a biblical way. So there's two things we got to recognize. First of all, the church, it commands us to function in a kingdom system, not in a governmental system as we understand it, but we are in a kingdom system different from the Jews. He says, but our citizenship is in heaven. You're not a citizen here. You have a dual citizenship. Your citizenship in heaven. He says, and we eagerly await the Savior from there, who is our Lord, the one who leads us, Jesus Christ. And then in Galatians, it says, there's no more, all those things that divided us under the systems in this world are no longer the systems by which we are divided. So he lays that out. Now, here's the challenge that we run into. Sunday morning is the most segregated day of the week. Martin Luther King states that. Now, I offend a lot of people when I say this, but I really don't believe that is the problem. And there's two ways I measure that. Number one, If we were not segregated on Sunday, would it make a difference to the mission of the church? It would make a difference to the Sunday morning, who's driving where, who's giving where, who's doing what. But it would not make a difference in the bigger picture. My thing is, and I don't think Martin Luther King was saying that as the issue, I think he's saying that as the indicator of an issue. I think Martin Luther King's message was, if we were what we were supposed to be, Sunday would look different. So don't change Sunday, just look at it as an indicator. It's kind of like the lights on your dashboard. You don't change the light. Like if the light come on, you don't say, well, let me take that bulb out. You recognize that if a light comes on, I got to do something over there and then keep watching the light to see if it goes off. If we're segregated on Sunday, then something else is wrong. We don't change the segregation, we change the other deal. The reason why is because if you change the segregation, then all of a sudden you are using segregation to fix segregation. You see what I'm saying? I got to look at you and your color to determine if I want you at my church. And that shouldn't be the case. It should be the net effect. Let me give you a couple of examples real quickly, and I'll just throw these out there. The school desegregation strategy was this whole belief, this foundational belief that if you put white people and black people together, then all of them, black people will begin to learn better. In other words, black people can't learn better unless you put them next to white people. So let's make things whitish in the hood and see if white people will come. And they didn't. So therefore, what you did was you exasperated the problem. And you exasperated the problem because as black folks got more wealthy, they now know where to go because they met some white folk who just went back home. So you had brown flight to increase. Now, it wasn't a thing that they did intentionality, but what they did was they focused on race rather than focus on the problem. The indicator rather than the problem. The same thing, Promise Keepers. One of the Promise Keepers, let me say this, and I know I ticked some people off last time when I said about Promise Keepers, but Promise Keepers is, I believe, one of the most effective ministries to drive men to be biblical in our responsibilities in our community and everything else. So I love the organization. I love Coach McCartney and all that kind of stuff. However, the net effect of the efforts to try to integrate. Remember, Coach McCartney's early issue was, I live out here and I have now my players who can live out here. In other words, I live in this place where houses cost this amount of money, and now some of my players can live out here also. However, they're driving back in to go to church. And he felt that they shouldn't have to drive back in to go to church, which is a reasonable assumption. But the problem wasn't that they didn't feel comfortable enough to go to the white church. The problem is that's an issue. And so he tried to resolve that problem across the country and did a phenomenal job. And so now you had a lot of the wealthy blacks who were driving back into the city to stop driving back into the city and say, we can go to these churches out here, these white churches, which is fine. In Kansas City Baptist Temple flourished because blacks started going out there, mostly wealthy blacks. Raytown Baptist Church, First Baptist Raytown flourished. What's the other one? Sheffield Assembly, they flourished. I mean, and these are all the churches that became multicultural. They became integrated. The problem is they became integrated with wealthy black folks. And when they became integrated with wealthy black folks, then all of the money that was being used for the social service programs in the city went away. So now some churches said, we're going with them. So they up and left the city. Some churches said, we're going to try to hold on to it. But now I need you, Raytown Baptist Church, I need y'all to help me. So now all of a sudden the experts that how to do urban ministry are not the ones controlling it anymore, because now I got to tell you how bad I am. And how much, I got to tell you everything that's wrong with me in order for me to be able to be acceptable as someone who you would give to. If not, you're going to ignore me and give the money to Haitians. I mean, y'all with me? So the net effect of looking at race first doesn't create what God was intended. So it's the chicken and the egg argument. So now, boy, I'm out of time here. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to hit you with Acts, with the book of Acts, and it was mentioned earlier, but I want to give you some solutions, the place where I want to spend most of my time. And in the book of Acts, some interesting thing happened. And we heard earlier the discussion was that they discovered that on Pentecost, all these people were coming together, but they were so culturally different, and they were defined by Roman system. Romans said, these are these people, these are these people. And what Roman did is they divided up how they would govern these sects under the umbrella of the Roman Empire, and that's how they defined themselves. We're these people, we're the suburbanites, we're the people that rule, so they define themselves by the governing system rather than by a biblical system. So when they all came together, and the Lord created an avenue through which they could start to communicate, because all of them were there for the same biblical reason, then they were shocked. The Bible says they were bewildered because they could understand each other. But the fact of the matter is their divisiveness kept them from understanding each other. So I think speaking in tongues is not nearly as important as understanding, because they didn't say we all spoke in tongues. What they said is we heard in our own tongue. In other words, all of a sudden we were understood, and people understood us who were all under the umbrella of God. Now, did you imagine if that happened, black and white? If all of a sudden we understood each other, what transformation that would make. But anyway, he goes through, and they raised the question. They said, what does this mean? So all these different people come together. There are three things that they actually did. In 42 of chapter 2 of Acts, it says, and all the believers were together, and they had everything in common, and they were selling their goods, their possessions of their goods, and they gave to everyone as needed. Every day, and then it says every day they came to the temple courts, and they broke bread together in each other's homes, and they ate, and they were glad with a sincere heart. So let me make some recommendations here. So I'm going to start with the first one. In the book of Acts, it says they were selling their goods, and they gave to everybody as the need was there. And so now let me tell you what we have to do if we want to get better. The first thing we have to do is we have to redefine our understanding of economy and use this comprehensive understanding to address the needs of the church at large in the city. And let me tell you this. There are three things. You can go ahead and put them all three up at once. Three things that define your economy. Number one is not just your money. It is your influence, and it is your authority, and it is your resources. If you skip the first two, not recognizing how rich you are in influence and authority, then you will skip what does take place. Let me give you a quick story. I was, with Brush Creek Community Partners. One of the things that happened is all my life, when I was a kid, since I was a kid, then Brush Creek, those who live here, you know what it is. Brush Creek used to kill 6 or 7 people a year because, on the east side of Truce, because the west side water would build up and it would come on the east side. But because it was on the east side, nobody did anything about it. So for years. When I got older and I was really trying to do some community stuff, I went and I had a conversation with a gentleman, Father Tom Savage, who was then the president of Rockhurst College, and we talked a little bit about what to do to be able to make this happen. I brought him the story of Nehemiah about rebuilding the walls. And so we had a good conversation about that, and we talked about how to do it. And the way we wanted to do it was to seek out all the Christians and then pull them together, those who are of influence. So I went and I met with the leading CEO Christians in the city, in the area. And we ended up with 12 and then eventually 25 board members. We had a organization that lasted 14 years, guided the rebuilding of the creek, did $3 billion worth of investment in the inner city, and have been the catalyst for beginning to bridge East and West Truce. But here's how the whole thing got started. I went to the CEOs and I said, I really need your help. And they said, well, how much do you need? Every single one. How much do you need? I said, I don't need money. What I need from you is I need you to commit to an hour and a half a month for at least 1 year, possibly up to 5 years. And so we had a discussion about it. That's it? You just want me to come? I said, yeah. If you can commit to that, that will be your Christian responsibility, because you have authority and influence that can change the city. So we got a commitment from all of them to come. So all of them were coming. So the mayor was listening. The governor was listening. The council people was listening. All these people was listening just because they came to the table. And so here I am, this small preacher with a church of 30 people, now guiding the Nehemiah transition that would lead to $3 billion worth of transition because they understood that they had influence and authority, and they ended up putting money in it anyway. But the key thing is they had a resource that could be used for the kingdom, and they were only using it for their jobs. The second thing is, let me go to the second thing, and then if I have time, I'll come back. And here's the one thing that recognizes. The research is very, very clear that when I walk in for a job interview, then I am least likely to get that opportunity unless somebody who looks like you have already said he's a good guy. Because the assumption is I'm a bad guy, and I got to win my way out of being a bad guy. And so one of the great things about having my name is Stan Archie. This is the whitest name that a black guy has. Okay. And everywhere I go, you have people who are like, when I went for my confirmation for the Senate, and you could see the difference. When I walked in, people were looking around and saying, okay, now they call it Stan Archie, so I'm walking up there, and they're looking around like, where is he? I'm like, oh, that's him, So all of a sudden, like when I go in for those kinds of things, when I was getting my security pass to the White House, because I worked with the last two presidents, so I go in, I get my security pass for the White House, all the stuff go all the way through. When I go in and you got to take a picture and all this kind of stuff, then when I go in there, people have actually come to me and says, how you doing? I'm looking for Mr. Archie. Is he with you? I'm like, yeah, he's always with me. But the idea is that if my name was Shaniqua, then the opportunity probably wouldn't have came in the first place. The next thing is they met in the temple courts every day. Now I want this to be really interesting because they're not meeting in the synagogue. What's happening is they're meeting in the temple courts every day. The synagogue, when we meet on Sundays, that is a huddle. That is where we discuss the game plan. That is not the game. And what we do is we say, if we integrate our huddles, the game will be better. No, it won't. You're going to have to pick some of those people to be on your team. And so when you play together. That's what makes you win. Having more people in the huddle only lets me know what you're going to do versus what I'm going to do when we leave the huddle. So we got to focus on the team. If we pick people and we integrate the team, what happens through the week, then the huddle will automatically become integrated. So I think that we're going backwards. The other thing is we have to have strategies in place to impact legislation. We're not impacting the system, and we can influence and impact the system. It's really interesting that I have a friend of mine who I was telling him about a problem that I have. And he's a wealthy dude. So I told him about a problem that I have, and he said, oh, well, let's set up a meeting and go down there and deal with it. So I was like, okay, whatever that means. And, he set up a meeting where 8 o'clock we met downtown at the downtown airport, and we flew into Jefferson City one morning. And when I got there, I had a meeting with a group of senators and a meeting with a group of House of Representative folks. And then we had a committee form out of that, and then we drafted some legislation and found some people who would present it. And then I flew back home, and I was home by 3 o'clock. I've never seen anything like that happen again, but I wanted to keep happening. And so, but that was my whole awakening to that, but that's what he did every day. So it was no big deal for him, but it was that influence that had we not had a biblical relationship together, then we never would have saw that happen. Here's the third thing we got to do, is we got to break bread together in everybody's home. We got to remove the media's influence, the cultural influence, and the customs of our society, and replace them with personal relationships. Get to know me. And when I come to your house, don't do the formal thing. We go to somebody's house and do it. When you come to my house, listen, here's what I've committed to. When you come to my house, we're going to eat just like we do. When it ain't there, we're going to tell you where to get your plate from, tell you where the food is, and there's going to be groups of people sitting over there. If you got kids, we're going to throw them in there with the rest of the kids. If they get hurt, we patch them up, sit them back out there with all the rest of them. You got to know how each other lives. We got to know the real us. You know, I tell you, one of the greatest times I had is I sit, you know, and I telling John, I was over at John's house, and we sat in the kitchen and talked for, I don't know, an hour. I don't know how long it was. That was like one of the best times, but more than anything, I began to know John as a real person. You know, and I think that's kind of what we're looking for. All right, I'm going to have to wrap up because my time is far gone. But I think we have to advocate for voices of each other in our vocational places, and then we must have at least bi-monthly strategic planning meetings to review the progress. So what we don't measure, we don't do. So we got to have a group of people to come together and say, these are the things that we need to do that make it look like we're progressing toward where God wants us to be. And then at the end of that, we got to be able to walk away clearly and say, you know, this is kind of what we feel like what God's wanting me to do, and here's how we're doing with it. And the congregation ought to hold us leaders accountable to that. They ought to say, what's the report card? And if we don't have nothing to give, then they need to give us those bad memos that y'all do from time to time. Here's the thing. Every now and then I have some assembly required. That is, things that used to be given to me already put together when I was little, now come in a box. So give me a table like this and a box this slim and that long. And they say, is some assembly required? I'm thinking, oh my God. And you know what I used to do all the time is some assembly required, I wouldn't take all the parts out. I would take all the parts out that looked familiar to me, and then I would try to put it together based on that. And there would be a whole lot of parts in the box that I would disregard. And you know what? Every single time it would break down. Because when the Creator put it together, they put it together with all of these parts for a purpose. And I have neglected to utilize the purpose for the original intent. When God put the church together, yeah, it's some assembly required. But there's not a piece in the box that you don't want to use to fulfill the purpose. So the reason why we keep falling apart is because we will not use everything that God has called us to use. Thank you.